In front of 280 guests, during what should have been the happiest moment of her life, Sarah Mitchell raised her hand and struck her future mother-in-law across the face. The sound echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. Champagne glasses froze mid-air. The string quartet fell silent. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. But that slap wasn't the shocking part. What happened in the 72 hours that followed would expose a web of deception so calculated, so cruel, that even the people closest to this family never saw it coming. This is the true story of a wedding that became a courtroom battle, a mother's obsession that destroyed her own son, and a bride who discovered that sometimes the person you're about to marry isn't the one you should fear most. Sarah Mitchell was 31 years old when she met David Chen at a charity fundraiser in downtown Boston. She'd spent the last decade building her event planning business from the ground up, working 16-hour days, skipping vacations, pouring every ounce of herself into creating perfect moments for other people's lives. Her father had passed away when she was 19, leaving her with nothing but a small life insurance policy and a lesson she'd never forget. The only person you can truly rely on is yourself. She'd taken that lesson to heart, becoming fiercely independent, carefully guarded, but underneath it all, desperately hoping that someday she'd find someone who could see past her walls. David was everything she thought she wanted. He was 34, a corporate lawyer at one of Boston's most prestigious firms, with the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He came from money, real money, the kind that bought summer homes in Martha's Vineyard and sent children to private schools where tuition cost more than most people's annual salary. But David never made her feel less than. On their first date, he asked about her business with genuine curiosity, took notes on his phone about her favorite restaurants, and when she mentioned she'd lost her father young, he reached across the table and squeezed her hand without saying a word. 3 months later, he told her he loved her. 6 months after that, he proposed on the same rooftop where they'd had their first kiss. The first time Sarah met David's mother, Victoria Chen, was at a family dinner 2 weeks after the engagement. The Chen family lived in a sprawling colonial in Brookline, the kind of house that appeared in architecture magazines and had a name instead of just an address. Victoria answered the door in a cream-colored cashmere sweater set and pearls, her silver hair styled in a perfect bob, her smile warm but her eyes cold and assessing. She looked Sarah up and down in a single sweep that lasted less than 2 seconds but felt like an eternity. Throughout dinner, Victoria asked questions that seemed polite on the surface, but carried an edge Sarah couldn't quite identify. Where did you go to college? What do your parents do? Oh, your father passed? I'm so sorry. And your mother? She remarried? How interesting. Sarah felt like she was being interviewed for a position she didn't realize she'd applied for. After that night, things began to change in small ways that Sarah initially dismissed as coincidence. David started canceling their weekend plans, citing work emergencies that always seemed to come up right after phone calls with his mother. When Sarah suggested they look at wedding venues, David hesitated, saying his mother had some ideas she wanted to share first. When Sarah picked out a dress, Victoria happened to stop by the bridal shop and gently suggested that perhaps something more traditional would photograph better. Each incident alone was nothing, but together they formed a pattern Sarah couldn't ignore. She mentioned it to David once, carefully, trying not to sound paranoid. He laughed it off, kissed her forehead, and told her his mother was just excited and wanted to help, but Sarah noticed he didn't look her in the eye when he said it. The wedding planning became a battlefield, disguised as family collaboration. Victoria insisted on approving the guest list, the menu, the flowers, the music. She had opinions about everything from the thickness of the invitation paper to the font used for the place cards. Sarah tried to push back, but every time she did, David would get a call from his mother, and suddenly he'd be asking Sarah if maybe they could just consider his mother's suggestion, just this once, just to keep the peace. Sarah felt herself shrinking, accommodating, swallowing her own preferences to avoid conflict. Her best friend, Monica, noticed the change and pulled her aside one afternoon. "You're not yourself anymore," Monica said. You're letting her walk all over you." But Sarah didn't know how to explain that it felt like she was fighting a war where she was the only one who knew there was a battle happening. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 weeks before the wedding, Sarah went to Victoria's house to finalize the seating chart. David was supposed to be there but got held up at work, leaving Sarah alone with her future mother-in-law for the first time since the engagement dinner. Victoria served tea in delicate china cups and made small talk about the weather, but there was a tension in the room that Sarah couldn't shake. At one point, Victoria excused herself to take a phone call, leaving her purse open on the chair beside Sarah. Sarah wasn't the type to snoop, but a corner of a manila envelope was sticking out, and her name was written across it in neat, precise handwriting. Her heart started racing. She knew she shouldn't look, but something told her this was important, that whatever was in that envelope would change everything. She was reaching for it when Victoria walked back into the room. Victoria's face changed instantly, the polite mask dropping for just a fraction of a second, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. She snatched the purse away, her fingers closing around the envelope like a claw. "That's private," Victoria said, her voice sharp. Sarah apologized, said she was just moving the purse to make room for the seating chart papers, but Victoria's eyes told her she didn't believe it. The rest of the meeting was strained and awkward. When Sarah left, she sat in her car for 10 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to understand what had just happened. She called David and told him about the envelope. He sighed, that same tired sigh she'd been hearing more and more lately, and said his mother probably had some old family photos she was planning to give them as a wedding gift. But Sarah knew that wasn't true. The look on Victoria's face had been fear, not surprise. Victoria was hiding something. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of last-minute details and growing anxiety. Sarah barely slept, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. She tried to focus on the joy of marrying the man she loved, but doubt had taken root in her chest like a weed she couldn't pull out. Monica asked her point-blank if she was sure she wanted to go through with it. Sarah said yes, but her voice wavered. The morning of the wedding, Sarah woke up at 5 in the morning with a knot in her stomach that wouldn't go away. She got ready in a fog, smiling for photos while her mind screamed at her to pay attention, to trust her instincts, to run. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon at a historic chapel in Cambridge, followed by a reception at a waterfront venue Sarah had dreamed about since she was a little girl. The chapel was packed with guests, flowers everywhere, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Sarah stood in the bridal suite, staring at herself in the mirror, trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. Monica helped her into her dress, a simple but elegant gown with lace sleeves and a cathedral train. "You look beautiful," Monica whispered. Sarah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a knock at the door. One of the wedding coordinators poked her head in and said Victoria was asking to see her. Sarah's stomach dropped, but she nodded and told Monica she'd be right back. Victoria was waiting in a small sitting room off the main hall, dressed in a navy blue gown with matching gloves, looking every inch the society matriarch. She smiled when Sarah walked in, but it was the kind of smile that didn't involve any warmth. "I wanted to give you something before the ceremony," Victoria said, reaching into her handbag. Sarah's heart stopped when she saw the manila envelope, the same one from 3 weeks ago. Victoria held it out, her perfectly manicured fingers. "Steady. I think you should read this," Victoria said. "It's information you deserve to have before you make the biggest mistake of your life." Sarah took the envelope with trembling hands. "What is this?" she asked. Victoria's smile widened. "Just some facts about your family that you might not be aware of. Things that would be embarrassing for the Chen family if they became public. Things that make me question whether you're really the right fit for my son." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside were documents, printed emails, photographs, and a report from a private investigator. The report detailed her father's life, twisting innocent facts into something ugly and suspicious. It claimed her father had been investigated for fraud years before he died, that her mother had been married 3 times instead of twice, that Sarah's event planning business had debts she'd hidden from David. None of it was true, but it was presented with enough official-looking letterhead and legal language to seem credible. There were screenshots of fabricated social media posts, photoshopped images of her father with people Sarah had never seen before, and a timeline that suggested Sarah had been lying about her background since the day she met David. The final page was a draft prenuptial agreement that stripped Sarah of any claim to David's money or assets, along with a clause that gave Victoria legal authority over any future grandchildren if the marriage failed. Sarah looked up at Victoria, her vision blurring with tears. "This is all fake," she whispered. Victoria shrugged, unbothered. "Is it?" she asked. "Because I have a very expensive investigator who would testify otherwise, and even if it is fake, do you really think David's family, his friends, his colleagues, won't believe it? Do you think you can fight me? I have money, connections, and time. You have nothing." Sarah felt like she'd been punched in the gut. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" Victoria's face hardened. "Because my son deserves better than some nobody with a dead father and a business held together with credit cards. Because I've spent 34 years making sure David had every advantage, every opportunity, and I'm not going to let him throw it away on someone like you. Because this is my family, and I decide who belongs in it." Sarah stood there, frozen, trying to process what was happening. Part of her wanted to collapse, to give up, to walk away from the chapel and never look back. But another part of her, the part that had built a business from nothing, that had survived her father's death and her mother's emotional absence, that part was burning with rage. She thought about every accommodation she'd made, every boundary Victoria had crossed, every time David had chosen his mother over her. She thought about the envelope, the lies, the calculated cruelty of a woman who had decided Sarah wasn't good enough before they'd even met. And she realized that if she walked away, now, Victoria would win. Victoria would always win, with every woman David met, every relationship he tried to build, because Victoria would never let anyone be good enough for her son. The ceremony started 15 minutes late. Sarah walked down the aisle with Monica by her side, her smile fixed and brittle. David stood at the altar looking nervous but happy, completely unaware of what had just happened. The officiant began the traditional words, and Sarah went through the motions, her mind racing. When they got to the part where the rings were exchanged, Victoria stepped forward, holding the small velvet box that contained David's wedding band. It was a symbolic gesture, the groom's mother presenting the ring that would bind her son to his bride. Victoria opened the box, her eyes locked on Sarah's, and whispered just loud enough for Sarah to hear, "You'll never be one of us." Something inside, Sarah snapped. Later, she wouldn't be able to fully explain what happened in that moment, what made her lose control when she'd held it together for so long. Maybe it was the finality of those words, the absolute certainty in Victoria's voice. Maybe it was the knowledge that if she didn't stand up now, she never would. Maybe it was just the accumulation of months of manipulation and cruelty finally reaching a breaking point. Whatever it was, Sarah raised her hand and struck Victoria across the face. The slap was sharp and loud, echoing through the chapel like a thunderclap. Victoria stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock. The guests gasped in unison. Someone screamed. David grabbed Sarah's arm, his face white with horror. "What are you doing?" he shouted. Sarah pulled away from him, her chest heaving, and held up the envelope. "Ask your mother," she said, her voice shaking. "Ask her what she's been doing for the past 3 months." The chapel erupted into chaos. People were standing, talking over each other, phones coming out to record what was happening. David snatched the envelope from Sarah's hand and started reading, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that looked like grief. Victoria was crying now, real tears that smudged her perfect makeup, playing the victim for an audience that was ready to believe her. Sarah looked around at the faces staring at her, some shocked, some disgusted, some curious, and realized she'd just become the villain in her own story. She turned and walked out of the chapel, still in her wedding dress, leaving behind the flowers and the guests and the man she'd thought she was going to marry. Monica ran after her, helping her into a car before anyone could stop them. As they drove away, Sarah watched the chapel disappear in the rearview mirror and wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life or the bravest decision she'd ever made. The video of the slap went viral within hours. Someone had uploaded it to social media with the caption, "Bride assaults. Groom's mother at her own wedding," and it spread like wildfire. By that evening, Sarah's phone was exploding with messages from strangers, most of them calling her violent, unstable, and crazy. News outlets picked up the story. Bloggers wrote think pieces about toxic brides and wedding drama. Sarah's name became a punchline on talk shows. The narrative was simple and damning. A bride had physically attacked an innocent woman on what should have been the happiest day of everyone's life. Nobody knew about the envelope, the private investigator, or the months of psychological warfare Victoria had waged. They just saw the slap, and that was enough to condemn her. Sarah spent the next 3 days in Monica's apartment, ignoring calls from David, from his family, from reporters who had somehow gotten her number. She barely ate, barely slept, just scrolled through the comments and articles and watched her reputation crumble in real time. Monica finally took her phone away and made her eat something. "You need to fight this," Monica said. "You need to tell your side." But Sarah didn't know if her side mattered anymore. The court of public opinion had already decided she was guilty, and the evidence that could prove otherwise was just paperwork that could be dismissed as fake or exaggerated. She felt like she was drowning, like the walls were closing in, like there was no way out of the hole she'd dug for herself. On the 4th day, Sarah received a call from an attorney named Rebecca Walsh. Rebecca had seen the viral video and the subsequent media coverage, and something about it didn't sit right with her. She'd done some digging, made some calls, and discovered that Victoria Chen had a history of interfering in her son's relationships. David had been engaged once before, 5 years ago, to a woman named Jennifer who had broken off the engagement suddenly and moved to California without explanation. Rebecca had tracked Jennifer down and learned that Victoria had done something similar to her, although not quite as elaborate. Jennifer had been threatened with exposure of a teenage shoplifting charge if she didn't end the relationship. When Jennifer refused, Victoria had made good on her threat, sending the arrest record to Jennifer's employer and getting her fired. Jennifer had left rather than continue fighting a battle she couldn't win. Rebecca offered to represent Sarah pro bono, seeing it as a case of defamation and emotional abuse that deserved to be fought. Sarah was hesitant at first, worried about dragging everything out, about making it worse. But Rebecca was persistent, and more importantly, she believed Sarah. Over the next 2 weeks, they built a case. They authenticated Sarah's father's clean record, proved the investigator's report was full of fabrications, and gathered testimonies from people who had witnessed Victoria's controlling behavior over the years. They also discovered something Rebecca hadn't expected. Victoria had created the prenuptial agreement without David's knowledge, forging his signature on preliminary documents that would have given her legal control over any children born from the marriage. It wasn't just manipulation anymore. It was fraud. It was illegal. The turning point came when Rebecca subpoenaed Victoria's phone records and found text messages between Victoria and the private investigator she'd hired. The messages were damning, showing that Victoria had explicitly instructed the investigator to fabricate evidence that would destroy Sarah's reputation. There were also messages between Victoria and David from months before the wedding, where David had expressed concerns about his mother's behavior toward Sarah. In one message, David had written, "Mom, you need to back off. Sarah is going to be my wife, and I need you to respect that. I'll make sure you see that before you make the worst mistake of your life." David had replied, "Just give me something concrete, any proof she's not who she says she is, and I'll end it." That message destroyed Sarah more than anything else. David hadn't been an innocent bystander. He'd been complicit. The private mediation happened 6 weeks after the wedding that never was. Victoria, David, Sarah, and their respective attorneys sat in a conference room downtown. Victoria looked older, smaller somehow, without the armor of her expensive clothes and perfect hair. David couldn't meet Sarah's eyes. Rebecca presented the evidence methodically, piece by piece, building an undeniable case of defamation, fraud, and emotional abuse. When she played the recording of a phone call between Victoria and the investigator, where Victoria explicitly said, "I don't care if it's true, I just need something that will make her leave," the room went silent. Victoria's attorney advised her to settle immediately, warning that if this went to trial, the criminal charges alone could result in prison time. Victoria agreed to a settlement that included a public retraction of all false statements, a significant financial payment to Sarah for damages and emotional distress, and a legal order prohibiting Victoria from contacting Sarah or spreading further false information. But the biggest shock came when David spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to add something to the settlement," he said. "I want to ensure that if my mother ever does this again to anyone, there are immediate legal consequences. I want her to get help, real professional help for whatever made her think this was acceptable." He finally looked at Sarah, his eyes red and exhausted. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have seen it. I should have protected you. Instead, I helped her." Sarah didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The man she'd loved didn't exist anymore, or maybe he'd never existed at all. The story should have ended there, with justice served and Sarah moving on with her life. But 2 months later, something happened that nobody expected. Sarah had used part of the settlement money to expand her event planning business, rebranding it as a company that specialized in helping people plan celebrations free from family drama and toxic dynamics. It was a niche market, but it resonated with people who'd experienced similar situations. Her first major corporate client reached out through a referral, wanting to book her company for a series of high-profile charity events. When Sarah arrived for the initial consultation, she found herself face-to-face with Martin Chen, David's father, and Victoria's ex-husband. Martin had divorced Victoria 15 years earlier, when David was in college. He'd left her because of the same controlling behavior, the same manipulation, the same inability to let their son live his own life. Martin had remarried, built a successful venture capital firm, and distanced himself from Victoria while maintaining a relationship with David. He told Sarah he'd followed the news of the wedding disaster and the subsequent legal case, and he wanted to help. Not just by hiring her company, but by investing in it, by helping her grow it into something bigger. He saw in Sarah the same strength that had taken him to finally leave Victoria, and he wanted to support that. Over coffee, Martin told Sarah things about Victoria she'd never known, patterns of behavior that went back decades. Victoria had driven away David's previous girlfriends, sabotaged his friendships, and created a world where David's only real relationship was with her. Martin had tried to protect David, but Victoria had weaponized the divorce, using custody battles and emotional manipulation to maintain control. He'd eventually stepped back, hoping that distance would help David see clearly, but it hadn't worked. David had just become more enmeshed in his mother's web. Martin's investment in Sarah's company wasn't just business. It was his way of saying that what Victoria had done to Sarah wasn't okay, that someone needed to stand up to her, and that Sarah had done what he wished he'd been brave enough to do years ago. 3 months after the failed wedding, David reached out to Sarah, asking if they could meet. She almost said no, but something made her agree. Maybe curiosity or maybe just the need for closure. They met at a quiet coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. David looked different, older somehow, with dark circles under his eyes and a weariness that seemed to have settled into his bones. He told her he'd been in therapy, working through years of enmeshment with his mother, trying to understand how he'd let things get so bad. He said he'd moved out of his apartment and rented a place across town, putting physical distance between himself and Victoria. He said he was sorry, truly sorry, and that he understood if she never forgave him. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she took a long sip of her coffee before responding. "You didn't lose me because of your mother," she said quietly. "You lost me because when I needed you to choose me, to protect me, to see what was happening, you chose her. Every single time. You asked her to find proof I wasn't good enough instead of trusting what you knew about me. You let her make decisions about our wedding, our life, our future, because it was easier than standing up to her. And even if you change now, even if you do all the work and become the person you should have been, I can't forget that when it mattered most, you weren't on my side." David nodded, tears streaming down his face. He didn't argue or make excuses. He just said, "I understand," and left. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, Sarah's business had tripled in size. She'd hired a small team, moved into a real office space, and started getting featured in wedding industry publications as an expert on navigating difficult family dynamics during major life events. She'd appeared on a few podcasts, carefully telling her story without naming names, focusing on the lessons she'd learned about boundaries, self-worth, and the difference between compromise and capitulation. People responded to her honesty, her vulnerability, her refusal to play the victim while also refusing to minimize what had been done to her. She became something of an advocate for people dealing with toxic family members. And while she never sought out the spotlight, she didn't run from it either. Monica, who'd been by Sarah's side through everything, became her business partner. Together, they created a company culture built on respect, authenticity, and the belief that celebrations should bring joy, not stress. They turned away clients who showed red flags of controlling behavior or refused to respect boundaries. They built a reputation for excellence but also for integrity, and that mattered more to Sarah than any amount of money or prestige. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. 1 year after the slap that changed everything, Sarah attended a wedding as a guest, not as the planner. It was her college roommate's ceremony, a simple outdoor affair with wildflowers and acoustic music. As Sarah watched her friend say her vows, surrounded by people who genuinely loved and supported her, she felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't pain anymore, or anger, or regret. It was peace. She'd spent so long thinking about what she'd lost that she hadn't fully recognized what she'd gained. Her freedom, her self-respect, a business she was proud of, the knowledge that she could survive something that felt impossible and come out stronger on the other side. The slap had cost her a lot, her reputation for a while, her relationship, her sense of safety, but it had also freed her from a life that would have slowly suffocated her. One compromise at a time. Sarah never heard from Victoria again. According to Martin, Victoria had moved to Florida, sold the Brookline house, and cut off contact with most of her social circle after the scandal. David had maintained minimal contact with his mother, mostly through therapists and supervised conversations, working on setting boundaries that should have existed decades ago. Martin and Sarah stayed in touch, their relationship evolving from business partners to something like family. He became a mentor, teaching her about investments and business strategy, but also about forgiveness and moving forward. He told her once that watching her stand up to Victoria had inspired him to finally address his own regrets about how he'd handled his divorce, how he'd let Victoria continue to control their son even after they'd separated. The question Sarah got asked most often, in interviews and by clients and by strangers who recognized her from the viral video, was whether she regretted the slap. Her answer was always the same: "I regret that it came to that. I regret that I didn't trust my instincts sooner, that I didn't walk away when I first felt something was wrong. I regret that I let someone else's opinion of me matter more than my own. But do I regret standing up for myself, even in a moment of complete loss of control? No, because that moment, as messy and public and humiliating as it was the moment I chose myself. And sometimes, that's what it takes to wake up." Looking back, Sarah could see all the warning signs she'd ignored, all the small moments where she'd felt uncomfortable but talked herself out of trusting her gut. Victoria's disapproval at that first dinner, David's pattern of choosing his mother's preferences over Sarah's wishes, the envelope with her name on it, hidden in a purse like evidence of a crime, her own shrinking sense of self as the wedding planning progressed. These weren't random incidents. They were chapters in a story that was always heading toward disaster, and the only question had been how bad it would get before someone said, "Enough." The slap had been Sarah's enough, delivered in the worst possible way at the worst possible time, but still, somehow, exactly what needed to happen to break the cycle. In her quieter moments, Sarah sometimes wondered about the other women Victoria had targeted over the years, the ones who'd walked away quietly or been driven out through shame and manipulation. She wondered if Jennifer in California had found peace, if she'd built a life free from the trauma Victoria had inflicted. She wondered if there were others, girlfriends from David's college years or high school crushes, who'd been deemed unworthy and systematically destroyed. Victoria's behavior hadn't started with Sarah, and if David hadn't finally started standing up to her, it wouldn't have ended with Sarah either. That realization haunted her sometimes, the knowledge that she'd been part of a pattern, that her pain wasn't unique but repeated, that Victoria's cruelty was a well-worn path she'd walked many times before. But Sarah also recognized something important. She'd survived it. More than that, she'd transformed it. She'd taken the worst moment of her life and turned it into purpose, into a business that helped other people navigate similar situations, into a story that gave hope to people who felt trapped in toxic family dynamics. She'd proven that it was possible to lose everything that mattered in a single moment and still rebuild, still find joy, still create a life worth living. That knowledge gave her strength on the hard days, when the memories crept in, or when she saw a happy couple and felt the ghost of what she'd lost. She'd survived. And that was its own kind of victory. 2 years after the wedding, Sarah met someone new. His name was Alex, and he was nothing like David. Where David had been polished and charming, Alex was genuine and straightforward. Where David had made her feel like she needed to earn her place, Alex made her feel like she already belonged. Where David's family had been cold and judgmental, Alex's family welcomed her with open arms and zero expectations. The relationship moved slowly, carefully, with both of them aware of what they were building and determined not to rush it. When Alex eventually proposed, he did it without fanfare or spectacle, just the two of them on a quiet beach at sunrise, and Sarah said yes without hesitation. They got married in a small ceremony with 20 people, no elaborate planning, no family drama, no stress. It was exactly what Sarah had always wanted but hadn't known she could ask for. During the ceremony, when the officiant talked about choosing each other every day, about building a life based on trust and respect and genuine partnership, Sarah felt tears running down her face, but they were happy tears this time. Alex squeezed her hand and smiled at her, and she realized that this was what it was supposed to feel like. Easy. Right. Safe. The slap at her first wedding had been an ending, painful and public and traumatic. This ceremony was a beginning, quiet and private and full of hope. Both were necessary. Both were part of her story. Sarah still runs her event planning business, now with offices in 3 cities and a waiting list of clients. She still tells her story when asked, though these days it's less about the slap and more about the lessons that came after. She speaks at workshops about setting boundaries with family members, about recognizing manipulation, about trusting your instincts even when everyone else is telling you you're wrong. She's become an unexpected voice in conversations about toxic family dynamics and the pressure women face to accommodate, to be nice, to keep the peace, even at the cost of their own well-being. She never set out to be an advocate or a public figure, but sometimes life pushes you into roles you never auditioned for, and you have to decide whether to embrace them or run away. The viral video still exists online, of course. Once something is on the internet, it's there forever. Sarah used to avoid looking at it, couldn't bear to watch that moment when she lost control, when she became someone she didn't recognize. But now, when she occasionally comes across it, usually when someone shares it with commentary or uses it as an example in an article, she can watch it with more distance. She can see the fear in her eyes, the way her hand shook before she raised it, the split second where she made a choice she couldn't take back. She can also see Victoria's expression in the moment before the slap, that smug certainty that she'd won, that Sarah would swallow the abuse and go through with the wedding anyway. And Sarah understands now that the slap wasn't about violence. It was about refusing to be silenced, refusing to disappear, refusing to let someone else's cruelty go unchallenged. It wasn't the right choice, but it was her choice, and it changed everything. So was justice served in the end? That depends on how you define justice. Victoria faced legal consequences, financial penalties, and public humiliation, but she never really acknowledged what she'd done wrong. David lost the woman he claimed to love, but he gained awareness and started the long work of healing from years of unhealthy patterns. Sarah lost her reputation for a while, lost her relationship, and lost her sense of safety, but she built something better from the ruins. Maybe that's the thing about real-life stories. They don't wrap up neatly with villains punished and heroes vindicated. They just move forward, messy and complicated, with everyone carrying a mix of regrets and lessons and the weight of choices made in impossible moments. If you found yourself in Sarah's position, standing in a chapel with evidence of betrayal in your hands and a manipulative mother-in-law whispering poison in your ear, what would you have done? Would you have walked away quietly, preserved your dignity, and dealt with it privately? Would you have confronted David first, demanded answers before the ceremony even started? Would you have exposed Victoria in front of all those guests, but with words instead of violence? Or would you, in a moment of overwhelming emotion and justified rage, have done exactly what Sarah did? There's no right answer, because the situation itself was wrong from the start. Sometimes we judge people harshly for how they respond to impossible situations, forgetting that we've never been tested in the same way. Sometimes the slap isn't violence. Sometimes it's a wake-up call. Sometimes it's the only language someone understands. And sometimes it's simply what happens when a human being reaches the absolute limit of what they can endure. What do you think? Did Sarah do the right thing, or should she have handled it differently? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying silent or standing up for yourself, even if it meant losing everything? How would you have dealt with a family member like Victoria? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these are the conversations that matter, the ones where we learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships and boundaries, hit that like button and subscribe so you can stay connected with more real stories about real people facing impossible choices. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself, even when the whole world is watching, even when it costs you everything, even when you're not sure you'll survive it. Because you will survive it. Sarah did. And if she can build something beautiful from the ashes of the worst day of her life, maybe we all can.